Hello and welcome. I'm Maria Ressa in Manila. This is Rappler Talk. Joining us from Jakarta is Sydney Jones. She is the head of IPAC, the Institute for Policy Analysis, and she has been watching terror networks in Southeast Asia for many years. Sydney, thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be here.
You just came out with a fantastic report last night. What were the significant findings of Marwan and the impact on the peace process?
We were looking at who Marwan was because we had seen just a lot of inaccurate information coming out after his killing. And we wanted to find out who he was and then try to think about the priorities of dealing with terrorism when you also have a peace process underway. So the main findings in terms of who Marwan was first, he was never a member of Jamaah Islamiyah. He was never a senior JI operative. He never took part in the Bali bombs because, among other things, he was already in Mindanao by August 2001. He was a member, but not the head of Kumpulan Mujahideen Malaysia, or KMM, and he was head of its Selangor branch, which was indeed radicalized by the Malaysian members of JI, or the Malaysia-based members of JI. So he had a very close working relationship, but he wasn't the master bomb maker, world-class terrorist that some of the reports have made him out to be. And the nicest quote, in some ways, from one of the Indonesians who worked with him was, "This was a little snake who was blown up to be a big dragon."
And the information that you received is, how did you get the information?
We interviewed Indonesians who didn't want their names used, but who were with Marwan in Mindanao.
What does this mean? How did it become so distorted? You have the FBI, the Department of Justice, the Rewards for Justice program calls him a senior JI leader, a KMM leader. Why did it get so distorted?
Well, he was a senior KMM leader. He just wasn't the head of the organization. But I think it got distorted for a number of different reasons. I think one of them was that Dulmatin and Umar Patek, who were senior JI leaders, who did take part in the Bali bombs, were in the same group with Marwan in the Philippines. And so he may have been so much associated with them that their characteristics rubbed off on him. Secondly, there was a senior JI operative from Malaysia named Zulkifli who worked very closely with Hambali, who's the only Indonesian in Guantanamo, notorious for his liaison role with Al-Qaeda. And there may have been confusion with that Zulkifli. And then finally, I think there's a process by which after every strike to target Marwan that failed, and people thought he was dead and then he turned out to be still alive, that added to his stature and added to the idea that this man was some kind of extraordinary figure who managed to elude death time after time after time, when in fact he just was never a leader and never was a master technician.
Your report makes it clear that this seems like a waste and also a danger, a threat to the peace process right now. Why has he then been the target of Special Forces operations for the last 2 years, I would say?
Well, I think, again, it's partly because of his association with the other foreign jihadis. So as one by one, first Dulmatin went home and got killed by the Indonesian police. Then Umar Patek got out of the Philippines without anybody's knowing it, got to actually Pakistan, to the same town where Osama bin Laden was finally found. And one by one, all of these other people were either arrested or managed to get out of the Philippines. And Marwan was the name that everybody knew who was left, together with the Singaporean, who's also not such a big character, named Muawiyah or Manobo, who still is in the Philippines to the best of our knowledge. And there are a couple of others still there. But I think it's because he was part of that group and because the idea that the Philippines still had foreign terrorists on its soil, I think that's what in part kept these targets going.
the death of the 44 police special operatives triggered a Senate investigation. In that Senate investigation, it seemed like many lawmakers were making the case that the MILF, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, maintains ties with terrorists, that it is a terrorist organization. Is that correct in your research?
I don't think it is correct, because I think what we saw repeatedly was that Marwan and people around him were actually very worried about staying with the MILF because they believed they would be betrayed by the MILF. So we had 2005 when the MILF leadership expelled them as a way of taking a positive step toward the peace process. And then repeatedly there were individuals who were harboring or providing refuge, in some cases from the MILF, but not with the permission or the approval of senior members of the MILF leadership, who made it absolutely clear that foreign terrorists were not welcome. Now, there is a question of how much the leaders could have tried harder to find out where he was, or whether there were members of the MILF who were providing refuge. But I think the overall message was clear that these individuals, Marwan himself, did not want to be with the MILF because he was afraid that if he was with them, he would be turned in.
Interesting. How would you gauge the impact on the peace process now of both the death of the operatives as well as the Senate process and the report that's coming out?
Well, I mean, first of all, just let me say it's an unbelievable tragedy for the 44 men who were killed, for the 18 MILF who were also killed, for the 5 civilians who were killed, and for the peace process, that you could have a process that was almost 20 years in the making now be questioned just at the time that it was reaching the final hurdle. And I think it raises the question of, when you have terrorism and a peace process, or you have counterterrorism operations and a peace process that are going to intersect, how do you ensure that the one doesn't undermine the other? And you do want to have terrorism dealt with in the Philippines, but even more, you want to have this conflict, which has been going on for so long, resolved. And I think the only way to do that is to work through the mechanisms that already exist. And that mechanism for the MILF and government happens to be the Ad Hoc Joint Action Group. Was it strong enough? Maybe not. Could it be strengthened? Yes. Is that important to do now? Yes. But I think that in hindsight, a lot of different things could have happened, but I think working through the AJAG would have been one way to go forward. And if the reason that they did not go through AJAG or did not contact AJAG until after the operation was well underway was that they were afraid information on Marwan's whereabouts would leak, then I think you have to think through what would have happened if he had gotten away one more time. Was it still not important to think about the timing of all of this, and the fact that we were coming to a critical point where we could get over the hump and finally get an agreement through the Philippines Congress? So I think coordination is critical.
This is probably the worst crisis now faced by President Aquino at the tail end of his administration, and right at a crucial moment when he has to use his political capital to get the Bangsamoro law passed through Congress. How does it look from Jakarta? I mean, in terms of where the president is now and what can happen next? How do you assess this?
Well, it's difficult to make assessments from outside the Philippines. I mean, we've followed the process as closely as we can. We've watched with almost unbelieving enthusiasm that the process could get this far, and we've given the president a huge amount of credit and also members of OPAP and others involved in the peace process, including the MILF leadership, for being willing to make the compromises that have gotten them this far in the process. So it would be a double or triple or quadruple tragedy if this were to set back a process which is already being watched closely as an example of how you can finally resolve conflict in this part of the world.
Were you surprised by the calls for war from some of the legislators and the public at this late stage?
You can understand how emotional this becomes, and you can understand how the videos that were circulating have just appalled people. The word brutality is used over and over again, but I think that it requires extraordinary leadership now to calm those feelings, which are natural, and just convince people that, in fact, the best way to ensure that this doesn't happen again is to actually get the agreement signed. If you were thinking through what the most important step that you could take to end terrorism, or at least make it manageable in the southern Philippines, it would be to have a legitimate government elected through the process that the peace agreement envisions.
What would happen if this law fails to pass?
I don't know. I think that's a question that people in the Philippines will have to answer. I think most of the people I've talked to don't even want to envisage that possibility.
You've watched the threat, but way before Al Qaeda came in, and then Al Jemaah Islamiyah sprouted the bombings in Bali, and how the network worked in Southeast Asia. How would you define the threat today?
Well, I think everyone in the region is worried about the Islamic State and the ISIS, as it's also called, and the number of Southeast Asians who are going to fight in Syria and Iraq, or going to take part in what they see as a great Islamic experiment with their families and their children. We just learned of another group that has gone into Syria, and there were 2 infants in the group, husband, wife, and 2 infants. And there are whole families that are leaving from Malaysia, from Indonesia. We don't think yet that there's any significant presence from the Philippines, but that could happen. And I think that's what's on the mind of virtually everybody watching terrorism now. And it's not just can they get to Syria, which it's clear they can. It's what happens when the people who are there return. And most of them don't have any intention of coming back, but some of them will. And we don't know what will happen if the situation on the ground changes in Syria and Iraq as well. But that's what's consuming everyone concerned about terrorism.
The other thing that's fascinating about Syria right now, ISIS, is that it is actually doing this recruitment in the virtual world on social media. Could you tell us what that looks like and how they are gathering the youth and getting them involved in ISIS?
Well, there are various strategies. Clearly, ISIS makes very active use of Twitter in all languages of the world, virtually. It has issued recruitment videos which appear on YouTube, which are easily downloaded, and links to those appear on radical websites. But probably one of the most effective uses has been Facebook and Google+, where people who are serving with ISIS can show their friends through a variety of handphones or over the internet and so on, exactly what their living conditions are. So some of the photos that are sent back almost look like tourist photos. There was one video that was posted by a Malaysian which showed him and some Arab colleagues in a fishing boat on the Euphrates, showing how clear the water was, and they had their guns with them, but it was almost a travel log for going to Iraq.
Why have governments done such a poor job of trying to deal with this radicalization on social media?
Well, before I answer that, I think it's also interesting to note the difference between Indonesia and Malaysia on this, because in Indonesia, unfortunately, it's still quite easy to be able to hold meetings of radical groups and extremists and so on. So you don't need the social media for finding fellow supporters of ISIS the way you do in Malaysia, where control is much stricter. So in the role of social media in Indonesia is more to reinforce people who have already been attracted through their participation in radical religious discussion groups and so on. It's still the case that radicalization just through the internet is fairly rare. In Malaysia, they're finding each other through the internet.
And what are governments doing about it?
There are efforts to try and control sites, but you know quite well that you can shut down a site and a mirror site appears the next day. There are efforts to try to encourage people to respond over social media just on their own, challenging some of the statements and teachings of ISIS that appear on social media. And that, in some ways, is effective. It's more effective if there's no link to the government, when citizens on their own write back and engage some of their friends in debates. And that's happening quite a lot. We've seen a lot of that on Twitter and on Facebook. I think governments are also trying to prevent people from going to Syria. One of the dangers, however, is that people who are frustrated at being prevented from going are often the people who are most inclined to use violence at home.
In the Philippines, what is the appeal? Do you see any radicalization happening on social media?
I don't follow the Philippine social media as closely. You probably can answer that better than I can. I think that we've seen a number of different groups hold oath-taking ceremonies, pledging their support to ISIS. That doesn't seem to translate into travel from the Philippines to the Middle East. But there's always the problem, which we've seen before in the Philippines, of migrant workers from the Gulf or from elsewhere in the Middle East going, and I think that's a concern of other governments in the region as well. One other issue is that we've seen a number of Indonesian and Malaysian students who were studying in the Middle East or in Pakistan be recruited to go into ISIS from their student groups abroad. So one of the things to think about is where some of the Filipino students in the Middle East may be studying and what kind of recruiting mechanisms exist there.
Let me bring you back to Marwan and to kind of tracing this evolution of this threat, because Filipino officials, security officials have said, continue to call the foreigners in the southern Philippines Jamaah Islamiyah. A Malaysian named Fikri, who was brought in, who was recruited by Marwan, became another senior Jamaah Islamiyah leader. How do we observers make sense of this? I mean, how did it, in your mind, how do you see the threat evolving from Jamaah Islamiyah to the foreigners who are there, to a man like Marwan, as the police and military have gouged out the top and middle rank leadership, and then you have like these people like Marwan there now who are now considered the top. How do we begin to take this apart?
Well, I think it was always a mistake to lump everybody together as Jamaah Islamiyah. And it was particularly unfortunate because in 2007, Jamaah Islamiyah stopped using violence of any kind in Indonesia. They had stayed on for a while using violence and regular attacks in Poso and Central Sulawesi, but the Bali bombs of 2002, the first Bali bombs, were actually the last time the JI as an institution supported bombing of civilians or indiscriminate bombings. We had a splinter group of JI led by Nurdin Top that then continued to do bombings until he was killed in 2009. But that was separate from the main Jamaah Islamiyah. And it becomes important to distinguish the JI people who had a structural setup in the Philippines, an actual branch and administrative structure. The last person to be arrested there was a guy named Tofik Rifki,
Yes.
from the people who were once JI members and then fled to the Philippines because they were fleeing arrest by Indonesian, Malaysian, or Singaporean authorities. Those people, for the most part, didn't join with the other JI people and were more inclined to associate eventually with Abu Sayyaf and became more dangerous than the JI people. So it was very important to keep the structural and the non-structural separate. Not to mention other groups from Sulawesi, from a faction led by Dar al-Islam, and from a group called Kompak, who were all non-JI, also more likely to join Abu Sayyaf, but also people who had links that went through Sabah, basically went through Tawau in Sabah and then across into Zamboanga, and were also involved in arms trading. So the reason it's important to distinguish who's who is because it makes a difference in chain of command. And if JI was telling people after 2007 not to get involved in violence, then to continue to call people JI suggests that somehow they are they're either not reporting to their chain of command, or that they're that they have characteristics that need to be disassociated. So it's just better to actually be as accurate as you can in determining what organization people belong to, what the goals of that organization are, and what their intentions now, ISIS in the Middle East, are.
Correct. But given that it seemed to have also gone more bottom up, right? What happened to the more violent guys who went with Abu Bakar Bashir? Like, I guess the Jama'an Shahud Tawhid. Is this something that do they have?
No, because that's interesting as well. Abu Bakar Bashir basically broke all ties with JI in 2008 when he founded JAT, Jama'an Ansharut Tawhid. And that was always a mixed organization. There were people in that only wanted Islamic law, weren't interested in violence. Abu Bakar Bashir did want violence, and there was a wing, a military wing, a clandestine military wing that was set up under JAT, but most of the members were not involved in that and not linked in that. And it was after Bashir, who's in prison now, decided to align himself with ISIS, that JAT split. So the majority of JAT members have now left the organization and are members of a new organization called JAS, which is only focusing on advocacy of Islamic law, and have very clearly distanced themselves from Bashir and from ISIS.
Fascinating. What about, so let's come back to the Philippines, the Abu Sayyaf, one of the leaders, Asnilon Hapilon, as well as the head of the BIFF, both had videos on YouTube pledging allegiance to ISIS. How seriously should the Philippines take this?
Well, I think they should take it seriously, and this brings us back to ATJAG and the Ad Hoc Joint Action Group, because terrorism is not going to go away in the Philippines, and it's going to be centered probably in areas that are in or near areas with MILF majority. So you will have splinter groups like BIF. You will have the ASG, and we'll see parts of the of Sulu probably joining the new Bangsamoro substate. So we've got to face the possibility that there will continue to be extremists that the leadership of the new substate will have to deal with, and the only way to do that is by having a good coordination mechanism that spells out very clearly what the steps are toward ensuring that these rogue elements, as they were called around 2005, aren't allowed to function.
And this is my last detailed question on Marwan. Earlier on, it seemed that Philippine police found his card in the house of Fatou Rahman Algozi, who was a senior JI leader. he seemed to be helping gathering these 21 tons of ammonium nitrate that was supposed to be for the Singapore plot against the embassies and Western offices. Was he part, you said he was never part of JI, but yet his cousin had 4 tons of ammonium nitrate in Malaysia that he helped, he and his brother was talking about getting that from them, and then he himself seemed to be helping Fatura Manalgozi. How do you make sense of that?
Well, I think there was a very close working relationship between the Selangor branch of KMM and some of the Malaysia-based JI operatives in the period around 2000 and 2001, just before the crackdown began in Malaysia. I don't know specifically about the hiding of the ammonium nitrate, but it's clear that it was the JI members that were urging the more radical of the KMM members, of whom Marwan was one, to undertake violent acts in Malaysia. So it's perfectly possible that it was through that working relationship that he helped hide the ammonium nitrate.
Fantastic. Sydney, your last thoughts on this? I mean, this is it's a very detailed report going over the years of Marwan in the Philippines, really the most detailed we've seen so far, and then your caution about the 17-year, this peace process. Your last thoughts?
Yeah, no, I just want so much for this peace agreement to succeed, and I hope that one result of all of these inquiries will be a workable way to develop a mechanism that can help coordinate any counterterrorism policies with any peace negotiations going forward, because ultimately it's the peace that's most important.
Okay, thank you so much. We have been speaking with Sydney Jones, the head of IPAC in Jakarta, Indonesia. There's a great report that came out just yesterday. It is on the site. Please take a look at it, read through. It's got the most details about Marwan that's ever been published. Thanks so much, Sydney.
Bye.
Bye-bye.